Good morning, everybody. We're just going to wait a few more minutes just for some more people to join the chat and to join this webinar. We see you there. People are coming in. It's good to have you there here. So just give us a second and we will get started soon. Thank you. If you're joining now, would you please just add your name into the chat and where you're from so that people know who's joined us for today? That would be great. Thank you very much. All right, so good morning for those that have just joined us. Welcome to the Early Childhood Systems, Perspectives and Research webinar series. This is a collaboration between Ilifa Labantwana, Research on Socioeconomic Policy at Stellenbosch University, and Data Drive. To kick off the webinar series for the year, we are going to be engaging today with the issue of age of school entry. Now, this may seem like a possible divergence from early learning, but in reality, this is a topic that is highly connected to and significantly affects early learning systems. At some point in your life, you will either have or you will know a child that needs to make the transition from early learning into formal schooling. And the decision about when a child should start school is sometimes, it's not as easy as it may seem, and especially if you're a parent. In South Africa, there is legislation that specifies the age at which a child must start school, the compulsory school age that's expressed, for example, in South Africans as billable. But there is also a minimum admission age, and the gap between the two is as much as 18 months. And particularly where children are born in the first half of the year, which is January to June, there can be as much as a year's leeway in when a child should start, and even though you're still compliant with the law. So ultimately, a parent or a caregiver has to determine what is in the best interests of the child and making careful observation as to whether a child is ready for school. And that decision may be informed with the guidance of ECD practitioners. And it also has implications for whether a child stays in an early learning program for an extra year. In this presentation by Bianca Böhmer, titled An Unequal Start, Impact of Age of School Entry on Academic Repetition and Performance in Grades 1 to 4, she is going to be shedding more light on this very interesting topic for us, and specifically looking at the relationship between age of school entry and academic success in the early grades. Bianca is a researcher and a PhD candidate in economics at RESEP, Stellenbosch University. She holds a master's degree in applied economics from the University of Cape Town, and her research focuses on education in low-middle income countries, with topics of interest that include foundational literacy and numeracy, learning trajectories, and educational assessment, teacher training, and professional development. She's also interested in inequality and gender in education, as well as education system planning and financing. So Bianca, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to learning from you. During the course of the presentation, if you have any particular questions of interest, please would you put them in the Q&A, and we'll be able to address those questions at the end. Thank you very much. Are you ready to flag the presentation, Bianca?
Thank you so much for the introduction, Gabby. And welcome to everyone that's online. Very happy to be presenting to you today. So my name is Bianca Böhmer, and we're going to be looking at the impact of school age of entry on outcomes in the foundation phase up to grade 4. So just a quick outline of what we'll look at today. So I'll introduce the topic, overall introduce kind of age of entry. We'll look at the data that we're looking at within the South African system, and then also what the South African schools admissions legislation looks like. We'll then jump over into the more technical stuff with the methodology of how we went about estimating results, looking at the results, and then we'll discuss and conclude. So to start, Does a child's school starting age matter, and how? So there's policy relevance to this question in that there's explicit admissions age legislation that is set by the government, but it also, mainly through the route of repetition, affects things like the cost efficiency of a system. Right at this moment in time, it's also interesting because we've just changed the compulsory school age, moving this to include grade R in the B level. So it's relevant at the moment. For parents, this is also whenever their child is in the age of getting to schools, there are decisions to be made around the appropriate age. This might be within the existing legislation or even whether to send a child late or early. So taking a step back quickly, if we look globally at what happens from a school entry age perspective, if we look across the globe at what countries and territories do and have done from the 1980s, we can see that each of the colors is a different starting age, where the green is 7 years and the red is 6 years. And we can see that over the last 40 years, countries have in general moved away from a 7-year start age to a younger 6-year start age, which is now the most common globally. That is at the absolute age level. There is a second level at which age is relevant, and this is the relative age. Now, here it matters what your age is relative to the rest of the children in your cohort. And this can influence both the experience and the outcomes of children. The reason that this relative age comes about is that there are, in most school systems globally, minimum school entry thresholds or compulsory school ages. And this clear regulation states when a child is supposed to start school. And because there is a single intake annually, so every 12 months only, you end up with a cohort of children, of peers. Because these things are set, a child's birth date ends up determining where they fall within that cohort, if everyone goes to school at the correct age. Essentially, whether they're old or young. So let's say you enter in the calendar year in South Africa, a child that's born in January would then be older than a child that was born in December, if that was the range where kids were entering. Now, we then have this 12-month gap, essentially this 1-year gap between the oldest and the youngest in the grade. And this 1 year is developmentally significant at such a young age. At the age of 5, it's 20% of your entire life, a little bit less than 20% once you're 6 years of age. So it's quite a large share. And this has been looked at quite extensively and across a number of different systems. If you track the outcomes of older versus younger learners, you find that they score higher marks on standardized assessments and in school marks. They have lower grade retention. They're less likely to be diagnosed as having a learning disability. They, even in some systems, attain higher levels of schooling, but also on more of the non-cognitive side, they're less likely to be bullied, are more likely to show leadership skills. Now, some of this, although not all of this, sometimes extends even beyond school, where in some systems, older children are more likely to attend a university or college and may have higher starting wages. It's also not necessarily the same across all groups, this difference. It tends to be larger for lower income learners and for boys in some cases where differences have been found. But whether or not you are older or younger, and this leading to better outcomes is not the only thing that matters. So relative ages are also seen in peer effects. And here it's not the older, but the younger children in the grade that tend to benefit. And this is because there are positive spillovers. Things like a younger child might look up to the slightly older kids in their class, be motivated, learn from them. But also older kids tend to be slightly less disruptive. So a younger child in their peer group may end up with a more conducive learning environment. There's also just advantages to starting a bit earlier, where that may mean finishing a bit earlier, and therefore you have a longer time in the labor market. However, as we said, that 1 year is very significant when you are younger. However, as kids age, so let's say at 17 versus at 7, this 1 year gap would be far less significant overall. So we expect some of that difference to just naturally fade out as kids age. And in the end, the thing that we really care about is how much is a child learning over the course of 1 year. And if a child that is younger is learning less over the course of 1 year, or a child that is older is learning less because of just that age, then this might be seen as somewhat of a problem. However, otherwise, it's really, we care about, are all kids in the class learning what they need to be learning over 1 year. All right, so the data that we used to take a look at this was the data-driven districts data set that runs from 2017 to 2023. Now, this is drawn from the SA-SAM system. So we're looking only at schools here, even when we look at grade R. And that data then is entered by both public and by independent schools and includes learner information, but also things like school marks. This particular data set also allows us to track individual learners from one grade to the next. So we can see if kids reappear and how they do over time. The data comes from 6 provinces: the Eastern Cape, Gauteng, KZN, Limpopo, and Mpumalanga in the Northwest. This is about 80% of total primary school enrollment in those provinces. And we will look at 2 outcomes in this presentation. We will look at repetition in grades 1 and grade 4. And this is because those are the 2 first grades in each phase. So we're able to see a more realistic measure of repetition because you're not constrained. And we'll also look at the term marks, and here only at home language, although the overall analysis was also done on maths and first additional language. So from this larger data set, what we did is we tracked one single cohort. So we started with the grade 1s in 2018. We made sure that they were the first time that the children were entering grade 1. So anyone that we found in 2017, we left out. And we then saw from this group who we were able to find in grade 4. So we had all of the kids that we, from the 2018 cohort that we tracked to grade 4, and that then makes up a balanced panel. So where we have children in both grades. This balanced panel, or for the grade 4s, we used a same grade approach. So for any learner that repeated, we used the outcomes in grade 4 in the first year that they did grade 4. So if they did grade 4 in 2021 and 2022, we used the 2021 outcomes. So from all of this, we ended up with about 680,000 children that we tracked through from grade 1 to grade 4. So it's a relatively large sample that we're looking at. Then the South African admissions system. Here, within the South African Schools Act, there are 2 portions in Section 3 that talk to age of admissions. So the first bit sets the minimum admissions age, and they talk here about grade R and grade 1, where for grade R, you have to be 4, turning 5 by the 30th of June in the year that you start, and for grade 1, 5, turning 6 by the 30th of June. There is also a compulsory schooling section on this front, and before Bella, this pertained to grade 1, where children needed to attend school from the year in which the learner turned 7. This has now shifted under Bella to apply to grade R, where a child needs to attend school from the year in which the learner reaches the age of 6. So what this leaves us with, if we look on the 1st of January that a child is starting school, for grade R, that learner is allowed to be between 4.5 and 6 years old. And for grade 1, a learner is allowed to be between 5.5 and 7 years old. Now we have this 18-month window in which children are supposed to enter grade R or grade 1. We'll look mainly at grade 1 here. At the same time, there is still some choice lying with the parents and also potentially with the school to either admit a child early or delay their entry by another year. Now, this could happen due to parents believing that it's advantageous to their child to either enter early or later, or there could be some sort of family or a child-specific situation that prompts this. So on the early entry, perhaps access to school meals, or on the delayed entry, there could be a health issue, or it could be decided that it's a good idea for a child to repeat grade R or grade RR. When we then take a look at how this legislation is applied, this 18-month window, I'll focus on grade 1. For grade 1, the underage portion is given by the gray at the bottom. And in 2018, we see that in this data, about 3% of kids came in underage and about 4% overage. So this is about 6% of kids that are not entering within that legislated window. And this falls even further, particularly a drop in the underage in 2023. So overall, when we look in South Africa, there's a relatively high rate of compliance with this 18-month entry window. If we then take a look at this by month of birth, we can see that most of the overage and underage entry is taking place in that second half of the year. Now, children that are born between January and June are able, because of the 18-month window, to either enter when they are 5 or so grade 1 when they're 5 or when they're 6. For anyone born between July and December, those children have to enter when they are 6. And we can see here that most of the underage entry happens in July. And this is because the minimum age threshold is at June. So the youngest possible children that are supposed to be entering grade 1 would be those born in June. So the kids coming in July have just missed that window. Similarly, the maximum age threshold, the oldest you can be is if you are born in January. So the kids coming in here in December, November, and even October have just missed this maximum age threshold. So this view really is one of a system that is relatively closely following the legislation. There's a second thing that we find, which is that whilst this 18-month window exists, when we look at what schools are actually doing, most schools tend to admit kids that are within a 12-month age range. So what this plays out as is that a school generally either admits children that are between the ages of 5.5 and 6.5. We call these mid-year schools or the mid-year policy. Or schools tend to admit kids between 6 and 7. And we call this the calendar year policy or calendar year policy schools. So essentially the mid-year policy are schools that are admitting kids at the earliest possible age within the given legislation, and for calendar year schools, the oldest possible age. We then take a look at some of the overarching stats coming from the mid-year and the calendar year schools, and we see that they look quite different. So expectedly, the age at which kids are entering is much lower in mid-year schools at just above 6 years of age and about 6.5 for calendar year schools. If we look at marks, just looking at home language to start, they're slightly lower within mid-year schools than what we see in calendar year schools. And whilst a two marks seems very little across over 600,000 children. That's a significant difference. And we also see that in mid-year schools, repetition rates in grade 1 over the foundation phase, so repeating at least once there, or repeating grade 4 is higher than that for calendar year schools. It's worth noting that if we look at the total number of kids across each of the two schools, almost 90% of children are attending at a mid-year school. So this is by far the more commonly taken route. If we then take a look at the types of schools that are implementing each, if we break this up by quintile, so quintile 1 to 3 are no-fee schools, so poorer schools. Here, almost all schools follow the mid-year policy. Across quintile 4 and 5 schools, particularly for quintile 5 schools, here it's a little bit more half-half, where almost 60% of schools are instead following the calendar year policy. So there does tend to be a culture of sending kids to school earlier in poorer contexts. There are also some provincial differences, some of which are explained by the wealth differences, and some appear to be just specific to that province. For example, very close following of the mid-year policy in KZN and Limpopo. All right, then taking a look at the methodology. So the key question that we're wanting to answer is, if we take a look at the age a child is when they start school, how does this affect how they perform in grade 1, in grade 4, and sort of in between? We'll take a look at repetition and home language marks for this. So there's 3 major things that we need to make sure that we're taking into account. The first is the 2 different school age policies that I've just described. We ran analyses separately for each of these sets of schools. And in this presentation, I will focus on the mid-year schools because that's the majority of children. We see very similar patterns across the 2, though. Then for the home language marks and maths and FEL, we do use non-standardized school-based assessment marks. So where this is relevant, we use school fixed effects. So this is where we are comparing children within their own school. And then lastly, we expect to see some selection into under and overaged entry. So using overaged as an example, we expect that children that are entering school late are probably slightly different to just a randomly selected child. This is because there's some reason we expect that this child would have gone to school later. So this means that we potentially have children with more academic challenges that are going to school later, which may then bias the results. So we deal with this using a statistical technique called instrumental variables and using the expected age of entry to adjust for this. And what do we find? So at first, if we just take a look, on the x-axis of this graph, we have the age at grade 1 first entry on the 1st of January of the year they enter grade 1. And on the left, we have the grade 1 repetition rate. This is for mid-year schools only. The mean repetition rate is 13% across everybody. And we can see that for the kids that are entering at the correct time for a mid-year school between 5.5 and 6.5 years of age, there's a strong downward sloping line. So this means that every month, essentially, that a child is older, they are less likely to repeat grade 1. And it's a significant gap. For kids that are entering earlier than that, the likelihood of repeating is even higher. However, for kids that are older, we see that there is a jump here where kids that are coming in older than anticipated are at higher rates of repetition. This almost certainly is an indicator of some sort of selection in terms of the kids that are entering at a later age. If we then break this up by gender, we see that there's significant differences. So the boys are the blue, the green line at the top, and the girls are the orange line at the bottom. Now, it's very clear that at any age, overage, underage, or within the correct age, boys are much more likely to repeat than girls. So the overall mean repetition rate for boys was 17% in grade 1 and girls 9% at the mid-year schools. So we see that for girls coming in at 5.5, they're sitting at about 15% repetition, whilst boys need to be almost 9 months older before they start repeating at about 15%, 14%. All right. We then adjust this for the selection. So what we're looking at here is the relative age effects on repetition and home language. And the repetition here, we get a 16 percentage point difference. So what this means is for a child, if we selected a random child and they were to go to school a year later, let's say they were born in June and instead they went to school a year later, they are 16 percentage points more likely to not repeat. So in reverse, if a child was going to school a year later, they are 16 percentage points less likely to repeat that grade. This is a sizable difference. It's greater than the mean. So we really do see large effects on repetition as a result of school entry age. We see exactly the same if we look at home language, where marks are higher for kids that we would expect to be a year older, where if you were anticipated to be a year older, it would be almost 13% more that you would be getting for your home language mark. If we then look at this across the different quintiles, we see there's a relatively clear pattern, where for quintiles 1 to 4, so poorer schools in general, this gap between oldest and youngest in terms of repetition is higher than the gap between oldest and youngest that we see for quintile 5 and independent schools, and the opposite in terms of marks. If we then track beyond grade 1, and we look at the likelihood of repeating at least once over the entire foundation phase, the mean here is 25% repetition. So about a quarter of children are repeating once in either grade 1, grade 2, or grade 3. So have done so by the time they reach grade 4. We see exactly the same downward sloping curve. What we also see is that now kids that started overage are almost at the mean in terms of repetition. So it does seem that there is a little bit of a difference there in terms of those two groups. Then we go all the way to grade 4. And if we compare the repetition rates in grade 1 and grade 4, you can see on the right that for grade 4, first of all, the mean repetition rate is much lower. It's at 7%, not 13%. But also that slope is much less well defined. So essentially the gap between oldest and youngest seems to have declined somewhat. So some fade out, as expected, we seem to be seeing. We then check this by tracking how kids do in their ranking. So we assigned each child a percentile, so where they sat within their school in grade 1 for home language. So if you look down the columns, for the home language quartile, the 25% of kids with the lowest mark in their school are in that first quartile, whilst the 25% of kids with the highest marks are in the fourth quartile. We then also looked by birth quartile. So where the oldest here are the kids that, based on their birth date, we expect should be the oldest in their cohort. So for mid-year schools, these are kids born in July, August, and September, whilst those in the youngest birth quartile would be those born in June, May, or April. We then see, if we look from grade 1 to grade 4, how likely it is that a child would improve their ranking in their school. Now, the first thing to note is if we go down the home language quartiles, we see that those starting lowest are most likely to have improved their ranking by grade 4. This makes sense. They have the most space to move up. Then, if we look across birth quartiles, we see that for kids that were in the bottom 25%, if you were from the oldest birth quartile, about 64% of children were able to move up in their rankings, while 69% of the youngest. So it looks like the mobility of younger kids is higher than that of kids that started older. This suggests that there's a divergence, that that gap is getting smaller between oldest and youngest. If we then take a look at the lowest quartile versus the top quartile, we see that the difference between oldest and youngest in the top quartile, home language quartile, is only 25% to 26%. So there seems to be less convergence for the kids at the top end. So the bottom half seems to be driving some of this catch up and fade out. And this is sensible. So if we're seeing a fade out effect that is largest for learners in the bottom half of the distribution, it's relatively likely that this is at least partially achieved through repetition, given that about half of the kids in that bottom quartile, in those two bottom, in the bottom half, would have repeated at least once over the three grade 1, 2, and 3. So what this means is that when we are repeating learners, they are receiving one additional year of schooling. That's a whole extra year of instruction, which we know does lead to significant improvements, at least over a couple of years. But kids are also becoming 1 year older relative to their peers. And this increase in maturity will also be contributing to some of that catch-up. And lastly, they're assessed in a different year. So this is against a different cohort, but it also means that there's some comparability that needs to be taken into account between those two. So where this leaves us is considerations and possibly a bit of a conundrum when we think about school readiness and what this potentially means for these higher rates of repetition. So if we take a look at the previous Thrive by 5, where it was broken down into quintiles, looking at whether or not kids were on track for grade R. In the poorest quintile of schools, only 38% of kids were, whilst in the richest, about 58% of kids were on track to start grade R. Now, if we look at the proportions of schools that are using the mid-year policy, so are letting kids in as early as possible, for the poorest quintile of schools, about 98% of schools are having kids come in mid-year, whilst for the richest in quintile 5, only about 42% of schools are using this mid-year policy. So what this means is that the least school-ready children are attending schools where they are likely to start between the ages of 5.5 and 6.5. These are also the schools with the highest rates of repetition. So we do need to think about, when we think about this though, For a parent choosing whether or not to send their child to school when they're 5 or when they're 6, they and the schools need to consider, and also from a policy perspective, what other alternatives are available to that child. Because even if their likelihood of repetition goes up, what matters is what else they would be doing. And so this is what they would be doing in grade R or within an early learning program. And if the alternative is schooling versus early learning, schooling may still end up being a better option for that child if the sort of early learning system that is required is not in place. Nevertheless, there needs to be an increase in awareness and information that is made available to parents around the options that are available to them around when they can send their children to school. But also there's a role here for grade R, but also early learning centers to be involved in this discussion around school readiness. So in summary, if we look at the admissions legislation, in South Africa, this makes provision for an 18-month period for children to enter grade 1 or grade R. Schools, however, tend to implement a de facto policy of either the mid-year or the calendar year policy, so admitting kids as early as possible or as late as possible. Within this system, we have a relatively high level of compliance for school entry age policy, and there's been some improvements over time. However, specifically reducing the amount of kids entering early is something that could be improved still. We also find that for grade 1, and actually across the entire foundation phase, we find a strong relationship between academic performance and repetition and when kids are entering school. However, we see some of this fades out, partially driven by repetition by grade 4. So from a policy perspective, the current legislation that we have has relatively high levels of flexibility and compliance, and generally is working as intended. However, when thinking about both entry age policy, some of the compulsory schooling, but also cost optimization around repetition, it is necessary to think about some of these school entry ages and how they affect this. But in any of these discussions, it is critical that we consider the alternatives available to parents and schools. And lastly, in the broader context of improving schooling and learning within South Africa, it's important to remember that adjusting the age of entry does not change any instructional practice. So whilst this might shift things around something like repetition, it is likely not going to be the sort of key lever that fixes or changes kind of system level learning outcomes. Thank you very much.
Bianca, thank you for a really enlightening and clear presentation. This presentation, as indicated in the chat, will be made available on the Ilifa website, where there's the working series material, both all the various working papers as well as webinars up to date. So this particular webinar will be shared there as well. So I just want to thank you for your preparation here, Bianca. I know this is a lot of work. Colleagues, as a person who works with data, this is a really painstaking analysis using what's available from the administrative system in South Africa. It's anonymized data that we get access to use with permission, and it really does reveal extremely interesting and very important patterns, not just on the schooling system in South Africa, but with its links to early childhood development. So we are also just grateful to various organizations that have supported this work as well as Optima, as I believe it. So thank you very much for that, Bianca. Are there questions? I see there are 4 questions in the Q&A, and I think it's probably best if I read them out. So I think the first one perhaps was already answered to some extent, but you can give some more clarity, Bianca. But the first question was from Rebecca Purcell, and it says, to what extent is the early entry in quintiles 1 to 3 schools possibly related to these being no-fee schools specifically? Perhaps, Rebecca, if you want to provide some more specific information on that, we can also get some more clarity on that question. There's another question from an anonymous attendee. Did you use the age of grade 1s to determine the school admission policy, or do you check it with the schools? Perhaps you want to start with responding to those 2 first, and then I will take some more.
Thank you, Gabby. So yeah, certainly for Rebecca's question, it is almost certainly related. So it's worth noting that these legislative changes happened before the school nutrition program came into being, but it's highly likely that the alternatives available for communities at these schools are just less in terms of childcare in general. So schooling was potentially the best, if not the only option, and free option. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense that for these schools, parents would have tried to send their kids as early as possible. And then once the school nutrition program came into being, then obviously there's even more of a reason. What is relevant from this perspective now is that with this push, even more of a push to make grade R compulsory, but also really to kind of extend what's available in the early learning space. This decision and the alternatives that are available to parents will change. And so this sort of calculus of, well, I can do this or do nothing. So send my child to grade 1 or do nothing might change. And therefore, then increasing awareness and making sure that parents do understand what is sort of available and what they can be doing becomes more important. And then relating to this kind of split into mid-year and calendar year, this is entirely based on data. So I don't think there's any school in the provinces that we've got that do this as explicitly. The Western Cape actually has an explicit policy, or did have an explicit policy of accepting kids between 6 and 7. It's now a bit softer, where they preference kids between the ages of 6 and 7. But I don't think any school is going around and saying, we are accepting children in these ages. It appears to be more of a culture, but we see very, very clear splits where large shares, like 90% of kids in most schools at least, are coming in within those bands. And it's quite a clear split actually for most schools as to where they sit between these, but it is based only on data. We didn't sort of phone up schools and ask them what they were doing. Yeah.
There is another question, Bianca, from an anonymous attendee. It says 1/4 of learners repeat at least once in the foundation phase, ? This seems very high, a high percentage, if we look at the policies in some areas that not to hold back learners, but promote them to the next phase. Did you use the SPA marks only to determine if learners actually passed, or do you check if they are in the next grade?
Yeah. Do you want to do 2, or shall I answer that one quickly?
I can take another one here as well that I'll provide. There's a question from Andrew Rudge. Is there any data on how many of these children attended ECD before starting grade R or grade 1, and what impact has this on repetition?
All right, great questions. Yes, the foundation phase repetition is extremely high. It's not quite as high as what we see in sort of grade 10 and 11, but this is another reason as to why this is necessary or useful to look at. because there is a question around how much maturity is playing into this, linked with school readiness, making sure we always remember that what's happening in the classroom is also relevant, right? You can adjust your teaching based on the kids that are in front of you. But in order to figure this out, we were tracking to see if kids were appearing again in a grade. So when we are looking at repetition here, we are seeing that the child is in grade 1 2 years in a row, essentially. It is only in a small number of cases where we sort of lose kids and get them back in grade 4, where we then use number of years. This would be a tiny percentage, but this would essentially look like you appear in grade 1 in 2018, and then you appear in grade 4 in 2022. And because there's a year missing, we presume that you repeated. But that's a very small percentage of children. So generally, we are seeing them twice in the same grade in the data. Right. And then, yeah, so we unfortunately do not have anything before grade R, but any child that was at grade R at a school, so not at a private early learning institutions, we do have that data. We do find that when we look at this, that kids that attended grade R at a school do better in grade 1. But a large share of kids are already attending grade R. So it's a little bit tricky because we expect that kids that are not attending grade R at a school, particularly in cases where we expect that means they're not attending grade R at all, the fact that they're doing worse might also be very similar to the reasons that they're not attending grade R, right? So like you're extremely rural and you struggle to get to school, or there might be something around family context. So yes, we do see that grade R improves outcome. So attending grade R at a school. So we can't even see when kids are in, so we don't even have the data on if they're attending grade R elsewhere. Does improve outcomes, but it's, or does correlate to better outcomes. But it's, we can't say as a result of that, if we then put a child in grade R, they will do better. We unfortunately don't have sufficient information to be able to make such a call.
Thank you, Bianca. There was a raised hand, I believe, from Papama Mateza. Papama Mateza, are you able to speak to us about your comment or your question? Could you unmute yourself, Papama, please? Okay, perhaps while we wait for that, just one more question I'll take here. I think there was a question from Mark Misselhorn. I think we have addressed it. Any comments or implications for grade R in light of this research and including grade R at schools versus ECDs? I think that's potentially been covered. But if you want to say more, Bianca. And then very quickly, there's another anonymous attendee who had a question around, wouldn't it be better for schools to move to a calendar year policy? And if so, how can this be advocated for? Has this research been shared with districts?
We actually haven't shared this research extremely widely yet within government policy circles or kind of publicly, although there is kind of, we are on track to do so in the next couple of months. From a kind of very technical perspective, because we unfortunately have certain data constraints and because the groups of schools are so unbelievably different along all measures, like wealth, even things like home language, race, it's very difficult to directly compare kids in mid-year schools and calendar year schools. We tried, but we simply don't have comparable, essentially school marks. So whether you repeat is decided by the school. So if you're repeating at a wealthy school or at a better or worse, like it's very difficult to kind of compare those two, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean, I do think that provided that we have good quality alternatives at grade R level and in the ECD space, then I do think that potentially 6 to 7 might be developmentally a better age. But I cannot tell you that using, like, we do not have the data to be able to make such a policy call. So I think it's plausible given what we have, but we unfortunately can't say for certain. There's nothing legislative, like there's nothing from a legislative perspective that actually needs to be changed to achieve what's being suggested. All that needs to change is that parents need to send all of their kids from the first half of the year a year later. Like it's completely within policy. There just seems to be a culture and a norm around how things are done. So it would then be a question of whether it's district driven or some sort of other thing of shifting how that happens. And I think this would be most beneficial for boys.
Thank you, Bianca, for that. Papama, are you ready to speak? Can you unmute yourself on your side? Okay, we have nothing there. There were Kirsty. I also believe that you had a question, Christy Paxton. If you would like to, yes, Christy, please. I think you are ready to. If you're ready to speak, if you can just unmute yourself as well. All right, I'm not so sure why we can't hear everyone. Perhaps there's still a problem with there might be a technical problem with this.
Hi there. Sorry, I didn't ask a question. I'm not sure why my name came up.
Oh, right. Okay, thanks. Anyway, nice to hear from you.
Did my hand go up by mistake? I'm sorry. I don't know how that happened.
No problem. All right. There's a question here from Kaylee Cook. Early learning program principals are expressing concern around the Bella Bill and schools in general as they take children younger and younger. And it means that less children in their ELPs, they're worrying when they rely on parent fees to keep running. What do you think the message to principals and practitioners of ELPs would be from this work?
I think, Gabby, you might have some opinions on this as well. But this is very definitely something that actually mainly Gabby and another colleague of ours, Grace, is thinking are thinking about precisely for this reason, which is that does it make sense also from a financial perspective? And this is both because of potential financial savings at the school level, but also keeping revenue at ELP level to delay this. So yeah, I mean, these have all been great questions or good question. And yeah, this is definitely something that we are thinking about.
Kelly, this is a highly topical issue. And I don't believe that this particular implication for early learning programs was considered sufficiently when this kind of ruling was compulsory grade R ruling was put in place. And I believe there's implications. I think we need to though carefully evaluate that and the extent of it. But you raise a very important question, and I think it should be something we are thinking a lot more about. All right, we've probably got time for another 2 to 3 questions at most, and I'm going to read out. There's one question here from Itumaleng Malefi. How did you take into account the policy of progressing learners to the next grade as a result of their number of years in phase? So learners are only allowed to be in a phase for 4 years. Therefore, they can only repeat a grade once in a phase, and having them move on with their age cohorts. In other words, are you making a distinction at all between repeating for the first time and then progression as opposed to a straightforward promotion in these early grades?
So we looked at repetition in 3 ways. So the grade 1 specifically, grade 4 specifically, and the reason we picked those 2 grades is exactly because of this. Because in grade 1, it's the first grade in that phase, and therefore anyone that is, so basically all children are still able to repeat, and same for grade 4. So that's kind of your cleanest signal of whether or not a child is or isn't repeating. The second thing that we then looked at was kind of across the entire foundation phase. And here I wasn't looking at kind of this difference between promotion and progression really as much here. We just saw, did kids at some point repeat? So it is possible that we have a child that repeated in grade 1, then did not reach the required benchmarks in grade 2 and 3, but we only pick them up as having repeated in grade 1 and in grade 4. So beyond kind of how we structured and what specific outcomes we looked at, I didn't look at promotion versus progression specifically.
Thanks, Bianca. Just on this, I think there was a follow-up point from Mark Musselhorn. He makes this point. So at this point, at least there is nothing compelling against children going slightly later than earlier. I think that's an interesting and relevant comment. And then there's another comment around, I think this is a comment as opposed to a question. What a different school system it would be if we respected the neurodevelopmental readiness of children. And I think there are in general big questions around what does it mean to assess school readiness effectively, so that better decisions are made around this matter. But I think there are also complexities, I'm sure, when there's also where schools offer free meals. There's a complexity that's added there, where we're not just dealing with matters of school readiness, but we're also dealing with this within a context of often limited resources in households, and that raises some additional challenges. And then there was another question, I think this is the last, Bianca. Can you say anything about the mathematics results in your study?
Yeah, with pleasure. So I selected home language. It was a bit of a toss of a coin as to whether I did home language or maths. But essentially, when we look across home language marks, maths marks, and first additional language marks, the patterns that we see are very similar. So they're kind of slightly shifted, but it's actually very similar. So I think for maths, the relative age effect is just over 13 percentage points. So kids that are a year older are getting about 13 percentage points more. We see exactly the same gradient. So where the younger you are, the worse you do in terms of marks. And we see the boy-girl differences. Yeah, I think there's further kind of combinations of boy-girl quintile differences across also the mid-year and the calendar year schools. But I think for these sorts of levels of, we will be releasing a working paper within the next month or 2. And I would, encourage you then to take a look on the math side here.
All right, and to close this out, I just, there's another comment around, but what are the outcomes for later? What are the impacts for later outcomes? Shouldn't we be trying to track this with respect to progress in the job market, with respect to entrepreneurship? Really thinking about the implications of this beyond schooling into the labor market. And there's a lot of work that is done on this, but I think the data challenges of linking children across multiple years can be very difficult, but it also just raises the importance of high quality administrative data that enables this. And we cannot do this work unless administrative data is provided to us in a way that we can do this linking over time to follow these longer term effects into the future. It really depends on data quality. And just to say, I mean, the South African system, the data quality is certainly improving substantially, but we still have a long way to go to be able to look at these medium to longer term impacts. Anything in closing, Bianca?
I suppose, yeah, just to finish up on that, I completely agree. I think the biggest direct outcome is that on repetition, but really we do care about what this means longer term. And certainly, yeah, there's scope to take a look at this more deeply, as well as just looking at the kind of direct policy implications.
All right, thank you very much, Bianca. Thank you everyone for your participation, for your engaging questions. And just to say that the next webinar will be on the 4th of March. That will be by Jessica Ronison. And the title of that presentation will be Appraising the Completeness of Road to Health Booklets at ECD Centres in Eastern Cape, South Africa, a multidisciplinary perspective. We look forward to seeing you there, and thank you for joining us today.